Imagine for a second that you are a judge. Like you're sitting behind the bench in a courtroom, and your daily job, your sworn duty, is to punish the guilty, protect the innocent, and uphold the law.
Right, a pretty heavy burden.
Yeah, super heavy. But now, imagine you're also a Christian living in the first century, and you've been explicitly instructed by Jesus Christ to turn the other cheek, like to never repay evil for evil.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So how can you possibly do both? I mean, how do you reconcile this command to forgive with the absolute obligation to protect?
It sounds like, when you put it that way, it sounds like a complete paradox.
It totally does. And so today on Reformed Thinking, we are going to look at how ancient theologians tried to solve that paradox.
Yeah.
And how their answers are actively shaping the battlefields of the Russia-Ukraine war right now.
Yeah, it's a huge topic.
It is. So welcome to Reformed Thinking. This is a deep dive where we take dense historical, theological, and legal texts and distill the most critical insights to shortcut your path to being well-informed, without the massive information overload.
Because there is a lot of noise out there.
There is so much noise, but you're joining a conversation designed to cut right through it.
Right. So today we have two really comprehensive theological and legal papers on the table. The first one is titled Justice, Peace, and the Sword, a reformed judgment on Russia's war against Ukraine.
Okay.
And the second one is called Ukraine-Russia War, Just War Reasoning in a Reformed Key.
Okay, before we even get into the details here, we have to state very clearly to you, the listener, that the sources on the table today contain highly politically charged content regarding the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah, we have to be super clear about that.
Right. We are impartially reporting on the arguments provided in these texts. We are taking absolutely no political or military sides here, and we are not endorsing the viewpoints of the content.
Right. We are just communicating the ideas contained in the original source material.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Because what we have here is this really fascinating look at how ancient theology intersects with modern battlefields.
It really is.
And before we can even think about looking at modern borders or tanks or, international law, we have to establish the scriptural baseline these authors use to define the authority of a government in the first place.
Yeah, that's really the only logical starting point. I mean, the sources anchor their entire argument in the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans.
Specifically chapter 13, right?
Right, chapter 13, verses 1 through 7.
So I think we need to paint a picture of what was actually happening when this was written, because we're talking about around AD 57, right?
Yeah, AD 57. And the Mediterranean world at this time is under the autocratic rule of Emperor Nero.
And Nero was not, don't say he wasn't exactly known for his gentle leadership style or his democratic principles.
No, absolutely not. I mean, he was a notoriously brutal autocrat. We are talking about a time of absolute state control, really heavy taxation, and the beginning of severe targeted persecution. And the authors highlight this very specific tension here. Paul is writing this letter to a super vulnerable religious minority living right in the capital city of this massive empire.
So the Christians in Rome were caught in the middle of this huge cultural and political pressure cooker.
Exactly. I mean, it was incredibly tense.
So what were the options available to them at that time? Like if you are a believer living under Nero, what are your neighbors doing?
Well, you basically had two extreme reactions happening all around you. On one side, there were zealot movements.
Okay, the zealots.
Right. These were radical groups advocating for violent, armed revolution against pagan Rome. I mean, they wanted to overthrow the government by force.
So armed rebellion.
Yeah. And then on the other side, you had groups who were tempted to withdraw entirely from civic life.
Like just run away.
Right. They wanted to flee to the desert, avoid paying taxes, and just live in quiet, isolated communities completely separate from the state.
Wow. So into this incredibly volatile, dangerous environment, Paul writes a letter that introduces a concept the authors describe as completely revolutionary.
Yeah, totally groundbreaking.
He says that civil government is an institution ordained by the decree of Almighty God to restrain human sin and maintain civic order.
Which is a bold claim to make while Nero is in charge.
Seriously. But here's the thing that really stands out in the text. The authors point to this massive structural contrast between what Paul says in Romans chapter 12 and what he says immediately after in Romans chapter 13.
Yeah, the contrast is just striking. So in chapter 12, Paul is giving instructions to the individual believer,
Right.
and he commands them to repay no one evil for evil. He tells them never to avenge themselves, but to leave room for the wrath of God.
So he's establishing this ethic of personal non-retaliation, like turn the other cheek.
Right. And then he just flips the script in chapter 13.
He completely transitions.
Totally. Having just told the individual to put down their desire for revenge, he turns right around in chapter 13 and establishes the duty of the state.
Okay.
He writes that the civil magistrate, the ruler, is appointed by God as an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer.
I have to push back here, just on behalf of anyone listening who maybe feels a bit of whiplash right now.
Yeah.
If the biblical standard for the individual Christian is to turn the other cheek and leave vengeance to God, how on earth do these authors justify a government using lethal force?
It's a huge question.
I mean, I thought that feels like a massive contradiction. How do you go from bless those who persecute you directly to the government can execute people?
Well, it looks like a contradiction until you look really closely at the Greek text the authors analyze, because they're drawing a hard, distinct line between you as an individual private citizen and you acting as an agent of the state.
Okay, walk me through that.
Well, the text explains that the civil ruler is defined in Greek as theodiakonos.
And what does that translate to in English?
It translates to God's agent or God's minister, and this agent is armed with something specific, the machera.
The sword.
The sword. But in the Greco-Roman world, bearing the sword wasn't just like a metaphor.
Right, it meant something real.
Yeah, it was a highly specific, technical phrase. It meant possessing the legal authority of life and death over subjects. It symbolizes coercive, judicial, and lethal force.
Okay, so the state actually has the right to use force.
Yes. The authors argue that the individual is forbidden from taking personal revenge precisely because God has appointed this temporal instrument, the civil magistrate, to execute justice on earth.
Let me see if I can translate this into a modern analogy, because this is heavy. I'm thinking about the difference between a private citizen seeking vigilante revenge versus a judge issuing a lawful sentence in a courtroom.
Okay, yeah, let's hear it.
Like, if someone steals my car and I track them down in an alley and I lock them in a basement, I'm committing a crime.
A pretty serious one, yeah.
Right? I'm acting out of personal anger. I am a kidnapper. But if a judge sentences that same person to 5 years in a state penitentiary, the judge is upholding justice.
Right.
On the surface, the physical action looks identical, right? Like a person is being locked in a room against their will.
But the context is completely different.
Exactly. The authority behind the action changes its moral nature entirely.
That analogy captures the author's argument perfectly. The action is transformed by the office. The sword isn't just like a decorative badge that the ruler wears to look imposing.
It's not just a prop.
No, it is an instrument of lawful force entrusted to the state to maintain justice.
So based on this reading of Romans 13, the authors are saying that pacifism, the idea that all physical force is inherently wrong, is actually a misreading of the text.
Yes, absolutely. The texts explicitly argue against movements like Anabaptist quietism.
And for the listener who might not be super familiar with 16th century church history, what is Anabaptist quietism?
Right. So during the Reformation, some groups, often labeled Anabaptists, believed that the secular world was just so completely corrupt that a true Christian could not participate in civil government at all.
So they just opted out.
Yeah, they believed you couldn't be a magistrate, you couldn't serve in the military, and you should just withdraw from society to maintain your purity.
So that's the quietism part, the withdrawal.
Right. And modern pacifism often shares a very similar DNA, arguing that the use of lethal force is always a sin, no matter the context.
But these sources reject that completely.
They do. They really push back hard. The authors assert that the state is a divine provision of common grace.
Common grace.
Right, because in a post-fall world, a world corrupted by human sin, human society would just degenerate into total anarchy without the coercive force of the state.
It would be chaos.
Exactly. The texts argue that refusing to use the sword when evil threatens the innocent is not a mark of high piety. It's actually a betrayal of the ruler's God-given duty.
Man, that is a very heavy burden. So the ruler is commissioned as an avenger to execute temporal wrath upon those who practice evil.
Right.
But wait, if the state has a sword to maintain order, what stops a king or a president from using that sword to just, conquer his neighbor?
Yeah, that's the big risk, isn't it?
Because a sword in the hand of a tyrant causes anarchy rather than prevents it. If the state is allowed to use violence, how do we define the moral boundaries of that violence?
And that question is really the pivot point of the entire discussion. And to answer it, the authors jump forward in history to the 5th century.
Okay, moving ahead.
Yeah, they move from the Apostle Paul to St. Augustine of Hippo.
We were looking at the year 410 AD.
Yes, 410 AD, which is just a cataclysmic year in Western history. The Visigoths sack the city of Rome.
Wow.
Yeah, the Roman Empire, which had stood for centuries as the absolute stabilizing force of the known world, is suddenly collapsing.
And the psychological impact of that event it cannot be overstated.
Yeah.
Rome was considered eternal. When it fell, people were absolutely terrified.
Total panic.
And a lot of pagan citizens started blaming the Christians. They said, we abandoned our old gods for your Christian God, and look what happened. Your religion of turning the other cheek made our empire weak.
That is the exact context in which Augustine sits down to write his monumental work, The City of God.
Okay.
The texts highlight that for the first 3 centuries of the Church, Christians lived under severe persecution and often held anti-military views.
Because they were the ones being persecuted by the military.
Exactly. They were entirely outside the halls of power. But by Augustine's time, Christianity had become the established religion of the empire.
So suddenly, Christians are the ones in charge of the city gates when the barbarian armies show up.
Precisely. And the Church faced this unprecedented ethical crisis.
I can imagine.
I mean, how do you respond when the city walls are breached and civilians are literally being slaughtered in the streets?
And you just turn the other cheek and let the city burn.
Right. And Augustine wrestled with this agonizing reality. And in doing so, he provided the grammar for what would eventually become just war theory.
And the texts are very clear on one thing. Augustine was not a pacifist, but he absolutely hated war.
Oh, he despised it.
He didn't see military greatness as proof of moral greatness at all. He categorized war as a tragic part of the misery of a fallen world.
He was incredibly suspicious of empire building. He warned extensively against a psychological and political condition he called libido dominandi.
And that translates roughly to the lust to dominate, right?
Yes, the lust to dominate. The texts point out Augustine's warning that empires often acquire massive territories through the sheer lust for domination.
They just want more and more.
Right, they conquer, they crush, they absorb their neighbors. And then they disguise their organized robbery with this lofty language of glory, civilization, and manifest destiny.
Which is highly relevant to the author's analysis of modern wars of expansion.
It is the direct link. The authors argue that historical grievance, civilizational destiny, or national honor cannot magically turn territorial seizure into justice.
Right, a land grab is a land grab.
Yeah. A state might have highly developed legal institutions. It might use religious symbolism. It might have beautiful architecture and a strong economy.
Sure.
But if its core objective is corrupted by pride and the desire to dominate others, its actions are fundamentally unjust.
I want to focus on this idea of peace for a second, because Augustine has a very specific definition of peace. I'm trying to think of how to explain it.
Go for it.
Okay, imagine the difference between a healthy, thriving neighborhood and a neighborhood that is controlled by a violent cartel.
Okay, I can picture that.
In the first neighborhood, you have kids playing in the street, neighbors talking over the fence, businesses operating normally. There is this sense of ordered conquered. People are interacting freely and safely.
It's alive.
Right. But in the second neighborhood, the streets are completely empty. It's totally quiet.
Eerily quiet.
Yeah, but it is quiet only because a violent gang has locked everyone inside their houses through pure intimidation.
Right, out of fear.
In both scenarios, there is an absence of active gunfire. There is silence. But only the first one is true peace. The second one is subjugation disguised as peace.
That is an excellent way to visualize Augustine's concept of tranquillitas ordinis, or the tranquility of order.
Or tranquility of order.
Right. Augustine observed that even those who wage aggressive, unjust wars claim to be seeking peace, but the peace they seek is a peace arranged according to their own selfish desires.
They want the peace of the cartel-controlled neighborhood. They want everyone to just be quiet and obey.
Right. The authors point out that an aggressor may sincerely say, "We just want peace," while demanding a settlement built entirely upon another people's subjection and the erasure of their independence.
Wow.
For Augustine, true temporal peace is ordered conquered. It is the tranquility produced when persons and communities occupy their proper relations under justice.
So the moral end of the war, like the type of peace you are trying to achieve,
Yeah.
must discipline how you conduct the war.
Yes, exactly. If the intended peace is ethnic absorption, revenge, or the permanent humiliation of a neighbor, the intention behind the war is just hopelessly corrupt.
The texts bring out a really fascinating point here about the concept of neighbor love. Because I think most people listening right now, when they hear the phrase love your neighbor, they think of volunteering at a soup kitchen or maybe helping someone change a flat tire or just being polite.
Right, interpersonal kindness.
Yeah. But the authors, channeling Augustine's thought, argue that failing to use force to protect the innocent from violent oppressors can actually be a failure of neighbor love.
It is a really sobering way to look at the command to love.
Totally flips it.
Yeah. If you have a public vocation, say you are a magistrate, a police officer, or a soldier, and you have the capacity to intervene, allowing the violent to destroy the innocent is not an act of love. It is negligence.
So if you see someone being assaulted in an alley and you have the means to stop it, walking away because you quote-unquote don't believe in violence doesn't mean you love the attacker. It means you have completely abandoned the victim.
That is a core component of the text's argument here. In this framework, force can be medicinal. It can be protective.
Medicinal. I like that word for it.
Right, but the authors are careful to say that force is never redemptive. You cannot save a soul with a sword.
Okay, that's a key distinction.
Force can check an outward evil.
Okay.
I mean, it can stop an invasion, it can stop an assault, but it cannot heal a rebellious human heart.
That brings us to Augustine's tragic sobriety. The wise person does not celebrate the necessity of war. They lament it.
Deeply. The wrongdoing of an opponent may compel a nation to resist, but that compulsion does not make the resulting slaughter beautiful or glorious.
Right.
Right? Intention includes the absolute refusal of cruelty, the refusal of vengeance, and a strict prohibition against taking delight in the suffering of the area.
So we have the Apostle Paul establishing the basic authority of the state to use the sword.
Yes.
We have Augustine establishing the moral boundaries of true peace and restraint, really warning against the lust to dominate.
Right.
The sources then move forward in time again to the 16th century. This is where these theoretical principles start getting baked into institutional documents. They draw heavily on John Calvin and the Westminster Standards.
We are looking at John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, specifically Book 4, Chapter 20, and also the Westminster Confession of Faith, Chapter 23. Calvin takes Augustine's realism and gives it a more explicitly institutional, structural form.
So what does Calvin actually add to the conversation here?
The authors note that for Calvin, civil government is not some embarrassing concession that exists outside of Christian discipleship.
It's not a necessary evil.
Exactly. It is an ordinance established by God for the external ordering of human society. The magistrate is specifically charged with a set of duties.
Which are?
Uphold public justice, defend the innocent, restrain violent wrongdoers, and preserve civil peace.
Calvin uses a very stark, unromantic comparison when talking about aggressive kings. He compares an invading ruler to an armed robber.
Yes.
He points out that just because someone wears a crown or holds a huge title or commands a massive army, that doesn't make their predation lawful.
It strips away all the pomp and circumstance of empire.
Right. So basically, if a guy kicks down my door to steal my television, he is a burglar.
Yeah, plain and simple.
And Calvin is saying that if a guy with a crown kicks down the border of a sovereign country to steal its land, he is just a burglar with a better public relations team.
That's a great way to phrase it.
The title doesn't change the crime. And Calvin argues that if local rulers have a duty to suppress robbery and murder within their own small towns, they can't logically just stand idle when an external foreign power threatens to devastate the entire country.
The authors point out that Calvin believed natural equity and public duty require princes to defend their subjects when they are hostilely assailed.
So it's a duty, not just an option.
Yes, and this fits perfectly with the biblical pattern they established from Romans 13, where authority is ministerial. It is bounded by the specific purpose of rewarding good and punishing evil.
Let's look at the specific phrasing from the Westminster Confession, because this is where the rubber meets the road for modern application. The texts mention that the confession allows Christians in public office to wage war on just a necessary occasion.
Just a necessary occasion. That phrase is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
It really is, and I have to ask on behalf of the listener because just a necessary occasion sounds like a massive gaping loophole.
Oh, for sure.
Politicians are incredibly skilled at framing their desires as absolute necessities.
Yeah.
Like a leader might say, I need to secure this neighboring port city. It is a necessary occasion for our economic survival.
Right. They can justify almost anything.
But how do these sources prevent leaders from claiming that every single conflict they want to start is a necessity?
That is the danger. And the texts address it directly. The authors clarify the strict theological boundaries set by these historical documents.
Okay, let's hear them.
The word necessary in this tradition excludes war as a convenient instrument of state policy.
What do you mean by an instrument of state policy?
It means a magistrate must not seize an opportunity for war simply because it is available or because the enemy is momentarily weak or, because it would be economically advantageous.
You can't just strike because the timing is good.
Exactly. War cannot be a tool you use just to get a better negotiating position on a trade deal. They must be compelled by strong necessity, meaning they must try other means first.
Furthermore, the texts list specific motivations that actually corrupt the use of the sword. Things like anger, ambition, revenge, dynastic pride, economic appetite, and the search for glory.
If any of those are the primary driver, the war is unjust, even if the ruler publicly calls it necessary. The ruler is evaluated as an accountable agent under God, not an autonomous sovereign who gets to define reality however they want.
The phrase, just and necessary occasion, is just carefully balanced by these theologians. The word just excludes aggression, revenge, and wars of conquest.
Right.
The word necessary excludes war as a first resort. And the word occasion directs attention to concrete, specific circumstances, like a specific attack or a specific threat, rather than providing a blanket approval for a nation's ongoing military program.
Exactly.
So we have spent a lot of time in the 1st century with Paul, the 5th century with Augustine, and the 16th century with Calvin. I think the obvious question for you, the listener, is how do these ancient, highly theological principles translate to a secular 21st century world?
It's a big jump.
Are we supposed to expect the United Nations to start quoting Calvin's Institutes?
Well, no, and the authors of our sources make a really fascinating move here. They argue that these exact principles, restraint, the prohibition of conquest, the duty to protect the innocent, are actually actively codified in global legal systems today.
They reemerge in modern law.
Right. The texts frame international law as an instrument of common grace.
We really need to spend a few minutes unpacking that term because it is so central to their argument. What is common grace?
So, common grace is a theological concept used to describe how God bestows goodness, order, and restraint on the whole world, not just on religious believers.
Okay.
Unlike special grace, which in Reformed theology refers to salvation, common grace is about the preservation of society.
So it's the idea that God's goodness can act through secular, flawed, human institutions, even if those institutions don't formally acknowledge him.
Exactly. It is a fallible civil tool that reflects genuine elements of natural justice. The authors argue that the law of nations, international treaties, and the Geneva Conventions are attempts by humanity to express and administer justice.
They are products of common grace.
Yes, exactly.
Let's look at the specifics of modern law then. The United Nations Charter is the central legal framework discussed in the papers. Article 2, Paragraph 4 outlaws wars of aggression.
Right.
It requires all member states to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state.
It basically makes aggressive war completely illegal. But then Article 51 of that same charter affirms the inherent right of individual and collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member state.
So the UN Charter has the exact same structural contrast as Romans 12 and 13.
Yes. The authors argue that this architecture in the UN Charter embodies the exact basic moral distinction familiar to Augustine and Calvin. Initiating coercive domination is fundamentally different from resisting it.
Right.
The Charter's restraint on force is not just some procedural hurdle. It places aggressive war entirely outside the bounds of normal statecraft.
The texts also mention very specific historical agreements relevant to the current conflict. They point to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum.
Oh, yeah, that is a critical piece of context.
It really is.
In that memorandum, Russia formally guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity and political independence. And in exchange, Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear arsenal, which it had inherited after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
I want to focus on how a listener should view these secular laws through a theological lens. Because just because a speed limit sign isn't a Bible verse doesn't mean it doesn't uphold the biblical principle of preserving human life.
That's a great point.
A speed limit sign is a secular modern invention. but it exists to stop people from driving recklessly and killing each other.
Right.
Modern international law might be secular, it is certainly flawed, and it doesn't mention God, but it functions as a mechanism to uphold these ancient moral truths. It restrains violence and protects the vulnerable.
That is a perfect way to frame the author's argument. Now, the texts readily acknowledge that international law is incredibly imperfect.
Oh, absolutely. People look at the UN and see a lot of resolutions that just go nowhere.
Right. It is selectively enforced. You have geopolitical vetoes on the Security Council, where powerful nations can just block actions against themselves or their allies.
It's a very broken system in many ways.
There is evidentiary uncertainty, and there is a constant temptation for powerful states to apply the rules unevenly depending on their strategic interests.
So a skeptic might say, the UN is toothless, international law is a joke, why should we care what it says?
And the authors point out a crucial logical step in response to that skepticism. They argue that imperfect enforcement does not nullify the norm.
Let's unpack that.
Think about the sixth commandment, thou shalt not murder.
Right.
We live in a world where murders happen every day. Sometimes murderers are not caught. Sometimes the criminal justice system fails to convict a guilty person.
The system fails a lot.
Right. But does the failure of the police or the courts to punish every single murder invalidate the moral law against murder?
No. Murder remains objectively wrong regardless of the effectiveness of the local police department.
Exactly. The same logic applies to international law. The failure of international bodies to stop every conflict or to perfectly enforce every treaty does not mean the prohibition against aggressive war is meaningless.
The norm remains valid.
It does. The texts cite the UN General Assembly Resolution ES-111 from March 2022.
That's the resolution that demanded an immediate withdrawal of Russian forces and officially described the action as aggression.
Yes. They also cite the International Court of Justice, which ordered a suspension of military operations.
So the rulings are on the books.
Right. The authors are arguing that even though these institutions do not possess flawless enforcement mechanisms, their rulings reinforce the conclusion that historical claims or security anxieties do not grant a nation a legal or moral license for a full-scale invasion.
The texts suggest that a proper approach to international law should be grateful, critical, and realistic.
I like that trifecta.
Right. We should be grateful that these structures exist to hedge against anarchy. We should be critical of their flaws and biases. And we should be realistic that international law cannot guarantee perpetual peace, because law cannot remove pride, fear, or ambition from the human heart.
We should defend its modest civil achievements without assigning it, like messianic abilities to save the world.
Okay, so we have built this massive framework. We have the biblical foundation of the sword, the Augustinian moral boundaries of peace, the Calvinist institutional duty to protect, and the modern legal structure of common grace.
It's a lot.
It's a huge foundation. Now, the sources apply all of this to evaluate the start of the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine. This brings us to the concept of jus ad bellum.
Jus ad bellum is the Latin term for the right to go to war. It identifies the moral character of the resort to force. Basically, when is it justified to start fighting?
What are the traditional criteria for this?
The traditional criteria include legitimate authority, just cause, right intention, last resort, reasonable prospect of success, and proportionality of ends.
Okay, so the authors apply these specific criteria and assert that there's a strong moral asymmetry in this conflict. They evaluate the claims made by Russia to justify the invasion.
Yes, they do.
What are those claims?
The texts analyze several claims. First, security concerns, specifically regarding NATO expansion. Second, claims of historical and cultural unity between the two nations. Third, the stated goal of denazification. And fourth, the Ruski Mir doctrine.
Let's talk about that last one. What is the Ruski Mir doctrine?
It translates to the Russian world ideology. It suggests the spiritual and cultural sphere of influence that transcends modern political borders.
So, claiming authority over a region based on culture rather than actual legal borders.
Exactly.
And what is the author's judgment on these claims using the just war framework we've built?
The texts conclude that these are, at best, background grievances. They do not constitute an armed attack that justifies a war of conquest.
Oh.
The authors argue that grievances, even if one assumes for the sake of argument that some of them deserve diplomatic consideration, do not establish the strong necessity required for a full-scale invasion.
Because crossing internationally recognized borders with armored columns, attacking civilian population centers, and declaring the annexation of foreign territory, all of that does not become morally justice simply because the president orders them or because domestic institutions rubber stamp them.
Exactly right. The authors conclude that the just cause criterion decisively favors Ukraine. They argue that a political community subjected to a large-scale invasion has a prima facie right to defend its people, its institutions, and its territorial integrity.
I think it is really vital to highlight what is actually being defended here. It isn't just dirt.
No, not at all. The wrong being resisted is not merely the loss of abstract lines drawn on a map.
Right.
Military occupation places living persons under coercive foreign control. It disrupts the lawful government, and it exposes civilians to violence, arbitrary detention, and the loss of fundamental rights.
The reality on the ground is grim.
It is. Defensive war is justified because it protects concrete neighbors and the civil order through which ordinary human life is sustained.
I want to ask about the concept of last resort, because this is a phrase that gets thrown around a lot in debates about the war. Some critics might say, well, Ukraine shouldn't fight back because fighting causes casualties. They should just negotiate.
You hear that a lot.
Right. Force wasn't the absolute last resort because they could have kept talking.
Yeah.
How does the concept of last resort work in real time when an army is actually advancing? Think of a home invader. If someone is actively kicking down your front door with a weapon, you don't stop and try to negotiate the terms of their entry through the splintering wood.
That is a very apt analogy. The texts clarify that last resort does not mean a nation must exhaust every theoretically imaginable diplomatic avenue while their cities are literally being captured.
Because that would just be surrender.
Right. Last resort means that force becomes permissible when nonviolent measures cannot adequately stop the grave wrong in time to save the innocent.
So Ukraine was not morally required to surrender its capital city while waiting for diplomacy to work.
The authors point out a critical distinction here. Negotiation is not the same thing as appeasement by definition, but continuing to fight isn't courage by definition either.
Oh, that's nuanced.
Leaders have a heavy moral burden. They must repeatedly consider ceasefires, mediation, and security guarantees that might reduce suffering. But they must do so without rewarding aggression.
Right.
The goal is to discipline state policy toward defensible public ends, not just to fight for the sake of fighting.
The sources also talk about the concept of collective assistance. This is the justification for other nations, like the United States or European countries, sending arms, intelligence, training, and economic support to Ukraine.
Yes. Article 51 of the UN Charter explicitly recognizes the right of collective self-defense. And the texts note that Calvin himself actually approved of defensive leagues formed by multiple nations to repel common threats.
But there are limits on this assistance, right? It's not a free-for-all.
No, there are strict limits. The authors insist that donor nations must continuously assess the risks of escalation, ensure accountability for the weapons provided, and prioritize civilian risk reduction.
Go.
The morally sound conclusion they draw is neither unlimited, unrestrained war nor imposed capitulation. The conclusion is that Ukraine may be justly defended, while every participant, Ukraine and its allies, remains morally obligated to seek a prudent and sustainable peace.
It is one thing to have a just reason to fight. We've established that the authors believe resisting an invasion is a just cause.
Yes.
But the sources are very clear that having a just cause does not give a nation a blank check on the battlefield. You don't get to do whatever you want just because you were attacked first.
That's a huge point.
And this brings us to the second half of the just war framework, jus in bello.
Jus in bello translates to right conduct in war. This is a critical distinction in the author's argument. Jus in bello judges the particular choices made by commanders and soldiers during the actual fighting. And here's the vital point. Its obligations bind both the aggressor and the defender equally.
See, that can be a hard pill to swallow for some people.
Yeah.
If you are defending your home against an unjust attacker, why should you have to play by the rules when the attacker is already breaking the biggest rule by invading in the first place?
It's a common reaction, but the authors argue that the equal application of battlefield rules does not erase the unequal responsibility for starting the war.
Right.
The rules exist to protect human beings whose inherent dignity does not depend on the justice of their government's cause.
So a civilian is a civilian, regardless of what side of the border they live on.
Exactly. The texts assert this very clearly. Russian civilians living in Russia remain neighbors made in the image of God. They cannot be targeted.
And Ukrainian civilians do not suddenly become legitimate targets, simply because military forces happen to operate nearby.
Right. And prisoners of war do not lose their moral status the moment they surrender their weapons.
The two big principles of right conduct in war are distinction and proportionality. Let's break those down. Distinction means a military force has to separate combatants from civilians. You can target a tank. You cannot target a hospital.
Simple enough in theory.
And proportionality means that the incidental, unintended civilian harm caused by a strike cannot be excessive compared to the direct military advantage gained.
But the authors highlight how incredibly agonizing modern warfare makes these judgments.
How does modern warfare complicate it? Because back in the day, armies just met in an empty field.
Exactly, but think about the modern environment. Armed forces frequently use dual-use infrastructure, like a bridge that carries both civilian traffic and military supply convoys.
Do you bomb the bridge or not?
Right. And drones and long-range missiles blur the physical distance between the trigger and the target. And electronic or cyber operations can produce massive indirect effects on civilian power grids or water supplies.
It's incredibly messy. The texts note a specific, sobering statistic here. They
Yeah.
cite a June 2026 UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission report.
Yes.
That report documented at least 293 civilians killed and 1,990 injured in Ukraine in a single month. The authors note this was the highest civilian casualty count in a single month since April 2022. Long-range missiles and drones were identified as the leading cause, with casualties occurring far from the front lines in urban centers.
It's just devastating.
But complexity does not dissolve responsibility. The text notes that a defender who abandons restraint corrupts the justice of his conduct.
That's a powerful statement.
Let's go back to an analogy. Think of a police officer who has a valid legal warrant to arrest a dangerous suspect hiding in an apartment building.
Okay.
That is a just cause. But if the officer decides to burn down the entire apartment building to catch the suspect, killing dozens of innocent people in the process, the just cause is completely overshadowed by the unjust conduct.
Yeah, that officer goes to jail.
Right. The officer becomes a criminal.
That illustrates the author's point perfectly. A just cause is not a license for unrestrained violence. The authors stress that war crimes such as torture, summary execution, sexual violence, hostage-taking, and the forced deportation of children apply universally.
They violate both Christian ethics and international law, regardless of who commits them.
Absolutely.
The texts mention the international criminal court warrants that have been issued concerning alleged war crimes, specifically including the unlawful deportation of children from occupied territories.
Yeah, and the authors maintain that legal accountability is essential, but collective vengeance is strictly forbidden.
So no vigilante justice on a national scale?
Right. The ICC warrants are described as formal accusations requiring rigorous legal adjudication, not as a permission slip for extrajudicial punishment or revenge killings.
Right.
Furthermore, the texts argue that Ukraine and its international supporters should welcome scrutiny of their own forces' conduct.
Which is hard to do when you're fighting for your life.
It is, but doing so provides evidence that their appeal to international law is principled and consistent, rather than just an instrumental tool used to attack their enemy.
So where does this leave the ordinary person listening to this deep dive right now?
Right, how do we apply this?
Because we have covered the dense theology of Romans and Augustine, the historical institutionalism of Calvin, the modern international law of the UN Charter, and the grim realities of battlefield ethics, how does all of this apply to the role of the church and the role of the everyday citizen?
Well, the texts argue for very distinct commissions for the church versus the civil magistrate. The church, as a spiritual body, is commissioned to proclaim the word of God and to form disciples.
Okay.
The authors emphasize that a Christian's primary allegiance to Christ relativizes every national, ethnic, or political loyalty.
So the church is not supposed to be a cheerleader for the state.
Precisely. The authors insist the church must refuse to act as a chaplain to geopolitical blocs or as a platform for partisan political strategy. The church should not wrap the cross in the flag.
I've seen that phrase before, wrapping the cross in the flag.
It's a dangerous mix.
It really is. However, they clarify that spiritual ministry does not mean maintaining silence in the face of glaring public evil, because Scripture authorizes the church to call things by their true names. Naming murder, theft, oppression, and deceit as sins is a core part of the church's witness.
Exactly. Churches may rightly condemn aggressive invasion. They may mobilize to comfort refugees and provide humanitarian aid.
But they must vigorously refuse state deification.
Right. The idea that the state is unquestionable or somehow divine.
The sources mention the 9th commandment here, which I found totally fascinating.
Yes. Thou shalt not bear false witness.
Right. How does that apply to a war?
Well, the authors apply this directly to the information war. Propaganda thrives by intentionally collapsing moral distinctions. In propaganda state, every criticism of the government becomes treason, and every enemy, soldier, or civilian becomes a monster devoid of humanity.
They strip away the humanity to make the killing easier.
Exactly. And the texts argue that even when a lie seems useful for boosting domestic morale, it is strictly forbidden by the Ninth Commandment. Moral clarity in wartime is strengthened by intellectual honesty, not by manufacturing falsehoods.
Furthermore, the texts discuss Christians who serve in civil office, like legislators, diplomats, and aid administrators. These individuals face the daunting task of translating these high moral principles into prudential, real-world decisions.
Because they can't just quote Augustine and expect the war to magically end.
Yeah.
They have to actually make policy. They may support national defense while simultaneously asking the hard, necessary questions about military strategy, weapon systems, and what political ends are actually attainable.
The authors also address economic sanctions, which is an interesting pivot. Sanctions are often viewed as a non-violent alternative to war,
Well, yeah.
but the authors warn that they must be highly targeted. Broad, sweeping economic measures can place a devastating burden on the poorest civilians of a targeted nation, while the political elites remain totally insulated.
Yeah, the people at the top rarely feel the sanctions. And broad sanctions can also inadvertently entrench authoritarian narratives.
Also,
Well, it allows a dictator to blame all domestic suffering on the foreign enemy. Look what they're doing to you, kind of thing.
oh, well, right.
The authors insist that sanctions must have robust humanitarian safeguards to ensure they do not simply punish innocent civilians for the crimes of their leaders.
So what does this all mean for the end of the conflict? Because the sources talk about the difference between true peace talks versus a ceasefire that simply freezes the conflict in place.
Yeah, that's a massive distinction.
How do we evaluate what a just peace looks like? Because if a ceasefire just leaves a massive population vulnerable to ongoing coercion behind a new militarized border, or if it simply gives an aggressor a few years to rebuild their army for a renewed attack later, it might just postpone violence rather than resolve it.
According to the authors, a just peace must protect the basic goods for which defensive force was justified in the first place.
Right.
It cannot make aggression an effective, profitable path to territorial reward. If a nation invades its neighbor and is rewarded with a permanent land grab, the international norm against aggression is shattered.
So a just peace has to involve accountability.
Yes. The authors argue that attention must be given to security guarantees, the restoration of political independence, the safe return of prisoners and deported persons, and credible accountability for war crimes.
But they also offer a note of profound, well, serious realism.
Yes,
No diplomatic settlement will achieve perfect, flawless justice in this world.
it just won't happen.
Finally, the texts state that the Church must continue to proclaim its core message, that civil justice, while necessary to restrain evil, cannot reconcile sinners to God.
Right.
The kingdom of Christ exposes every earthly claim to absolute rule.
So, to summarize the massive ground we have covered today, we have looked at how these sources synthesize Romans 13's mandate for the magistrate, Augustine's warnings about the lust to dominate, Calvin's understanding of the duty to protect, and the modern international laws that act as common grace.
Right. And the authors assert a morally asymmetrical judgment on the war.
Yes, they do.
They demand both a just cause to resist aggression and just conduct on the battlefield to limit human suffering. They offer a framework of sober courage.
It is a framework that calls aggression evil, defends the assaulted, restrains the use of the sword, mourns the dead, and seeks a just peace, all while confessing that earthly justice is always provisional.
It is an incredibly rigorous way to evaluate a devastating modern reality.
It really gives you a totally different lens to view the news through.
So we want to leave you, the listener, with a final reflection that builds on the text we've discussed today. We have spent a lot of time talking about nations, empires, and international law.
A lot of high-level geopolitical concepts.
Right. But if, as the sources claim, true peace is an ordered concord, a tranquility based on justice, and not just the absence of active fighting, what does that mean for our everyday interpersonal conflicts?
Oh, that is a challenging question, because it brings it right down to the living room.
Exactly. Think about your own life. Can we achieve genuine peace in our communities, in our workplaces, or in our families without confronting the underlying injustices that cause friction? Or are we sometimes just settling for the quiet of a frozen conflict, where everyone is silent, but no one is truly reconciled? Thank you for joining the conversation today. Keep questioning assumptions and keep seeking truth.